Hello, welcome to The Verdict, a podcast by the Carlson law firm. And in this series, we go all about car collisions, the injuries that happen because of them, and the surrounding topics. I'm your host, Jeffrey Hinkson, and in this episode, we're talking all about car collisions due to poor road conditions and road construction. And in this episode, I'm joined by Julie and Phil. And I wanted to cover this episode because specifically there can be instances where car collisions can happen because of poor road conditions or poor weather conditions, more specifically like really heavy rain or like snow, ice, and things of that nature. And also because road construction, there's buildings getting built in cities and, stuff can happen. So, I wanted y'all to introduce yourselves to start out, get the viewers, listeners to get to know y'all a little better. Julie, let's start with you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Julie Peschel. I am a partner here with the Carlson law firm, and I work out of our Temple office location. I've been practicing with the firm for probably 14 and a half years now, so I've had a great time just working every day.
Great, Julie. Thanks for being on today.
Thanks for having me.
And my name is Phil Koelsch. I work in our Killeen office. I've been with the firm almost 3 years, and I actually first started working with Julie.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you for being on too, Phil. Yeah, so like I said, I wanted to cover this topic specifically because instances can happen with poor weather conditions and also road construction. And I wanted to throw the first question to Julie, a rather simple one in the eyes, in the minds of like viewers and listeners, is that can you sue someone for a collision due to poor road conditions?
Okay, and are you talking about weather conditions, things like that?
Yeah, weather like heavy rain, snow, ice, things of that nature.
Okay, yeah. So absolutely. I mean, when you're driving in poor road conditions, which I think we've all been faced with, whether that be heavy rain or ice, legally, we're required to adjust how we drive to drive in a safe manner. So, for example, Texas law requires you to kind of slow down, increase your following distance between you and other cars, like when the road is really wet or if the roads are icy. And because, obviously wet roads become really slippery, your car can hydroplane and can just be harder to control. So really, additionally, like rain can make it really hard to see. I don't know about you, but I drive every day 45 minutes, and there have been times when I've been caught in torrential downpours where you can barely see the car in front of you. So, the key things would be slowing down, increasing your following distance. So when a driver doesn't do that and they cause a collision, then absolutely you can sue because of their, poor decisions and how they're driving due to the conditions that are in place at that moment. Another thing that kind of comes up sometimes with that is failing to properly maintain your vehicle. So we all have to keep our tires in good condition, our brakes in good condition, our lights in good condition. And so that can contribute in poor weather to causing an accident as well, and something that we look into when trying to go after a claim for those types of conditions.
Something to add to that point is, since Texas is such a big state, I think where the accident happens is so important because for example, I was born in Houston, lived there for about 10 years, and it rains all the time, like the kind where you can barely see in front of you. And negligence is just, failure to use ordinary care under the circumstances. And I think like a jury in Houston or Galveston would be much more willing to hold a driver negligent in heavy rain versus somewhere where it doesn't rain that much, comparatively, like El Paso, just drier area of the state. So it's just really fact specific when we're dealing with poor weather.
Yeah, because that was more interesting to me because, you would figure, like you had mentioned, Phil, like in El Paso, where it might not get that much rain because it's dry and something does happen, they're more, I wouldn't say lean, but I would say more, I guess, understanding in a sense because a driver might not be used to the heavy rain as, say, Houston, and which leads into another question I had. Is there, does it have to be unusual to that weather in more extreme conditions like ice? Like, because you had mentioned Houston gets a lot of rain. What about ice? Is it like that same mindset in that way also?
What do you mean exactly?
So like so say someone sues because of like poor weather conditions. So say ice is in the area like El Paso, like area that doesn't get that much ice. Can someone sue because of that, or you know?
Well, you can sue. I mean, it's like Julie said earlier, it's fact specific, and negligence is just failure to use ordinary care under the circumstances. So yes, you absolutely can if someone is driving too fast on ice. Though you mentioned extreme weather, I would say just with the caveat that the more rare and extreme the condition is, I think that makes it harder to prove negligence just because a jury would be more understanding like during that February ice storm, but you can still absolutely do it. It's under the circumstances.
Yeah, and absolutely. People just, we all learn in driver's ed, when you're hit with those rare circumstances that we don't get a lot, you still are required to react and drive in a safer manner under the conditions. I mean, that goes for night driving too, right? So,
Yeah, and something I wanted to bring in this because we're talking about poor weather conditions. It's so it's important to drive safely. Increase the distance between cars. And the other factor I wanted to bring in was insurance. Julie, like how would insurance play a factor when it comes to collisions in poor weather conditions?
well, we're all required to carry insurance. We're supposed to. And, the Texas state law requires at least you to cover a minimum limit. So if you or somebody else causes a collision due to your, poor driving decisions, and that could be centered around weather conditions, but it's really more how the person responds to those conditions. Then the insurance company does step in and will pay claims involving, whoever the insured driver is who causes the collision. Now, sometimes a collision is caused, somebody causes a collision and then they don't have insurance, or maybe they leave the scene because they may not even realize that caused the collision. Then that's when your own insurance would step in if you have something called uninsured, underinsured motorist. But absolutely, that's why we have insurance.
Yeah, for sure. And I wanted to ask both of y'all, starting with Phil, is that when it comes to the success rate for cases due to inclement weather, what is that like? Is it high? Is it low?
I'm about to use a lawyer's favorite word. It depends.
Yeah.
I mean, if you got a case like in the winter ice storm, I personally saw several people near my house lose control of their vehicle and hit like a curb, but they were going pretty slow and doing their best. Now, if you have someone who's speeding and chose to drive in the first place, because I can see a situation where you could convince a jury during the February ice storm, what were you doing on the road in the first place? Like, this is a 100-year storm. So you could argue that could be failure to use ordinary care, or you're going way too fast when you know that the roads are terrible. And it's just, but on the other side, you could have something, like in a bad lightning storm, it hits a tree, lightning hits a tree, the tree falls on the road and you swerve out of the way or hit the tree and lose control. You could run into, a situation where a jury could find that wasn't negligent because of the condition. Like, there's these affirmative defenses called, unavoidable accident or act of God. And in the situation I just discussed about the lightning bolt, that would be a hugely contested issue throughout the case, about how could the driver have done anything. The tree suddenly fell right in their path. So again, it just depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, it depends. Would you say the same thing, Julie?
So basically, it really depends on the circumstances and the facts involved. You have to really build the evidence to show why the person at fault wasn't acting like a reasonable person would under the circumstances. So, you want to get things like the police report, the photographs, witness statements, and really get to that stuff early before it's gone. Because it's going to be really necessary to really find all of that information to be able to prove a case and be successful.
Yeah, and because like building evidence and things of that nature to have the best case possible, I want to know something else, because like the building the evidence is that some things are rare in nature, like Phil had mentioned, like a lightning bolt struck a tree. But Julie, what are some cases where there's acts of negligence when it comes to poor road conditions?
I mean, it all goes down to, is the person driving too fast for the conditions? Are they following too closely? Do they fail to brake when they should? So it's all those things that we learn in when we're learning to drive that can cause the accident, which is the negligence. So specifically when it comes to icy roads or wet roads, it really has to do with driving too fast for the conditions. Maybe, not knowing how to respond if you go into a skid, driving too close on somebody, or, not using fog lights, all these different things that we're taught to do, and then just failing to do that. And that's where the negligence occurs.
Okay. And then Phil, I want to bring it back to you, because it's like a question mixed in with an example. So for instance, the Texas winter storm, the Texas ice storm that happened in February. So say I'm driving and I see someone else driving also. They're sort of in front of me or on the lane beside me, in front of me at the same time. Could I hold another driver accountable during certain weather events? So such an example, like someone else is driving and they have snow on their car and that they never scraped off, and it happens to hit my car and damages my car. Would I be able to do anything in situations like those?
Yes, I think in the example you gave, you would. I mean, it was a 100-year storm, and if the snow, and if you're going to choose to drive during really bad conditions, you should be especially prudent about the condition of your vehicle, making sure there's as little snow as possible and making every precaution before you even start the ignition. So yes, absolutely.
I think the hard part about that circumstance, because I read on Facebook, people were complaining on my local, city Facebook page about how people were doing just that during this February storm, like failing to clean off the snow and ice, and sheets of ice were just flying off of their car, which is really dangerous if you think about it. Like, that's a really dangerous condition that they're creating by not cleaning their car and then having that fly off. And if that hits another vehicle, it could, one, startle them or block their field of vision and causing a wreck. Just, it really depends. Or they could hit somebody who, I don't know why anybody would be walking in a storm, but you never know. But in that situation, that person who does it may not even realize that ice is flying off their car. They just may not even be thinking about it, because in Texas, we don't know about ice and snow. Like, we don't deal with this. Like you said, it's a 100-year storm, right? So we have no clue that you drive around and ice is flying off the back of your car. So in those situations, I think it's more likely somebody's going to do that, cause a collision, and then just drive off and not realize what has happened. And so could you hold them responsible if you could find them? Sure. But, the key is, can you find them? Will you have the opportunity to write down a license plate and track down the person who caused the issue? Probably not. So hopefully you carry uninsured motorist coverage for that circumstance.
Yeah, because I know there were definitely around that time, like after the initial storm was wearing off, but people still had snow on their cars, snow and ice. Like there were situations where I was driving beside people and they still had like full thing of snow. It's like you could clearly see the outline of the snow on their cars. So I'm like, man, like what happens is that here's my car, I'm done. Like,
And I don't think Texans think about that, like until I was reading about it on Facebook, I was like, yeah, that's kind of dangerous. It really is.
yeah. So I know we mentioned more about like these inclement rare weather events that do happen. Now I want to turn it less on more of the individual driver and more of the city itself. So I want to ask you this. When a city is about to have inclement weather, does it have to warn the population, the people of the city about the inclement weather that's coming?
No, oftentimes they do though, thankfully. We've all heard those annoying, radar sounds on your TV, but no, that they have no like legal duty to do it. You're ultimately in charge of your own safety.
Okay. Yeah, because yeah, I've definitely heard those before. It's like, especially sometimes now, I think it's like, I'm not sure if it's like the ambulance or something like that, where I get them on my phone now. Sometimes
Right.
it's like,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, Julie, now on this one, like stuff like tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes. That I know in Texas, some of those can be like really rare, but in the case that it does happen, and say I'm driving and somehow I get caught in an earthquake or hurricane, can I just go to my insurance and be like, hey, or something like that? Or is it much bigger? Is it like, oh, an act of God or something?
Well, so those types of circumstances can be what we call acts of God. And so what an act of God is really an accident that results from a natural cause that couldn't have been prevented, so it's outside of human control. Insurance companies oftentimes will put like clauses in their contracts that will exclude or limit coverage from liability for injuries and damage and any type of losses that may occur from those types of events, such as floods, tornadoes, and earthquakes, and anything along those lines. But it really depends on the clause. How is it written, to determine ultimately whether or not that contract, one, calls that type of an event an act of God. Oftentimes people can pay for extra insurance, like people that live near the coast and see hurricanes more often than people, not near the coast. You oftentimes pay for extra insurance that will cover you under certain circumstances, because flooding is more likely, or hurricanes are likely. And in California, I think you have to pay for earthquake insurance and things like that. And also, when it comes to acts of God, it doesn't take away all liability. Ultimately, we're all tasked with acting in a reasonably prudent manner. We have a duty to take care and try and prevent damage or mitigate our damages. And so, if we know there's a flood coming, what can you do to try and prevent as much damage as possible? So all of those kind of little factors go into play when it comes to whether or not you can recover on an insurance policy. So again, it depends.
And touching on that with acts of God, like legally speaking at court, it's actually really hard to get, or it should be really hard to have the judge instruct the jury that basically they can let the defendant out on an act of God. And the reason is what Julie alluded to, that, we're all tasked with, following ordinary care. And there's also the issue of, in almost every case, I don't think I've ever been a part of a case where the defense has said that the plaintiff didn't cause the accident themselves. So it's basically giving them an unfair advantage, giving the jury two outs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense because ultimately, like even me learning, hearing about this kind of stuff is like Like, because people hear about like, oh, it's the act of God, it's automatically like done for, but I didn't know specifically for insurances, like, oh, it's because of clauses in insurances. And then there might be some type of like not all liability at once is lost. There might be like a slim chance or a slight chance to at least do something. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right.
Okay. And so we covered everything about like inclement weather, acts of God, and things of that nature. And I wanted to sort of move on to more road construction. But before that, I have a quick fact I want to throw in for all the viewers and listeners is that according to the US Department of Transportation and the Federal Highway Administration, on average, there's over 5,891,000 vehicle crashes each year, but approximately 21% of those crashes, which is nearly over a little bit over a million, 1,235,000 are weather related. So this is sort of a high number if you consider like all the United States. So yeah, weather related incidents, collisions can happen. But moving forward on the road construction and construction, Julie, I wanted to start with you on this one. Do road construction cases deal with the TTCA, Texas Tort Claims Act? And before you give your answer, I did want to remind everyone that we did do an episode about the Texas Tort Claims Act and the Federal Tort Claims Act. I would suggest you watch that one also so you can get sort of like some background info because this will dive a little bit deeper in this topic also.
Yes, deeper is the keyword. Road construction cases pretty much all typically involve the TTCA. And just to give a quick summary of what that Texas Tort Claims Act does is, for governmental agency, any type of governmental agency, whether we're talking about the state, a city, a county, a school district, they're all generally immune from liability, or what that means is shielded from liability for injuries and damages, except in very limited circumstances. And so the TTCA is a statute in Texas that kind of delineates what those exceptions are when governmental entities can be held liable for their acts. And so even though it carves out these few exceptions, there's exceptions to the exceptions. So it's really convoluted. Road construction pretty much always involves either oversight by the state of Texas through TxDOT. Sometimes they will have the city entity. It'll be a city project. So there's always going to be a governmental aspect to these types of claims. There's also going to be some private companies involved because usually the state and the city will contract out to private engineering firms to help design the projects. They'll use private road construction companies to be the general contractors or even sign companies. So lots of different private companies involved as well that may or may not be provided that shield of immunity that the state or the city entities get. And again, as with most things that you're going to hear in this podcast, it depends on the circumstances surrounding it. So, in order to hold any of them liable, you kind of have to show one that there's a waiver of that immunity under the Texas Tort Claims Act. And the ways you do that are either there's, a motor driven vehicle involved. It can be the tangible use of personal property. It can be a case that has to do with what we call a premises defect or, a condition of the roadway that causes the injury or the issue. So, but these are harder when you're dealing with TTCA for premises type cases, because unlike premises cases generally in the state of Texas outside of TTCA, you have to basically prove that the governmental entity had actual knowledge of that condition and just failed to make it safe. They don't really have a duty necessarily to warn, or they don't have a duty to inspect, sorry. They do have a duty to warn of something they know about. But, there's a lot that goes into it. And absolutely, the TTCA is very much so involved.
Yeah, it sounds like very much involved. And Phil, I want to ask you, what is the process like? Because I know Julie covered some of it, but for you and your experience, what is the process like when dealing with the TTCA in cases like this?
Very detail oriented and nuanced. You have to follow the statutes very closely that allow you to sue a city or the state. Be very specific in how you plead the lawsuit, like meaning like how you allege what went wrong, so you can arguably qualify for the exceptions. And it's honestly best to avoid it if you can. And I say that because Julie touched on this in road construction cases. A lot of times cities will hire outside, engineering firms or construction companies just because they don't have the resources or time to do these projects. And unless these companies like follow perfectly and have really no discretion how to build or design the road on their own, they aren't protected by the government. So you can just sue them like you would any other company, and you don't have to basically follow these. They're not loopholes, but I say strict guidelines.
Okay.
These cases have a lot of pitfalls. They're time sensitive and they have a lot of pitfalls. So that's why, it's important to consult with an attorney who does these types of cases often, if you think that you have the need to do so, because failing to do that could mean failure to have a case.
Yeah, because the interesting thing that Phil had mentioned was like if it's like a private company that they hired, that you can go to them instead of having to deal with, I guess, like the city itself. Yeah, because I think people would get confused. They just see construction and automatically think of city. They don't think of private companies first, city-based companies in those instances. And the next thing I wanted to touch on was, Julie, is that what are some of the common instances of negligence in road construction?
Well, it can be a lot of different things. Something that I've seen a lot, actually, which is probably one of the easier type of cases to prove, is when there's a motor vehicle involved. So you say, they have their trucks. You see trucks driving across the freeway with all the cones and stuff. If a vehicle's involved and they cause a collision, that's way easy to waive immunity in a much simpler case to prove negligence. When it comes to other types of cases, such as, maybe we say they left a hole or, a big pit over there, they put a big mound of sand that was blocking the view, or, they chose to design the roadway improperly, causing a bunch of accidents. All of those would be negligence. They're just way harder to prove, because they're more have to do with the condition, or, you have to show that the entities have actual knowledge that there's an issue, and they just failed to do anything about it, which takes notice, and it's just a lot harder than if there's a motor-driven vehicle involved.
Okay. Phil, is there any other common acts of negligence you can add, or is there?
I think Julie touched on everything. I mean, maybe to be a little more specific, I think if you have a private company in the middle of the construction phase, they have a lot of times discretion about where they store their materials. I mean, that would be unusual for that to be in the original design plan approved by the city. So in a case Julie and I worked on together a few years ago, a big issue was that dirt was stored at a location off a highway that blocked the view of drivers, and it caused a ton of accidents, and that fell outside of the Tort Claims Act, and we could just sue the company because they chose the way they were going to store the building materials. But you could also have like just a sign, that's misplaced, that shouldn't be there. That would be an act of negligence by the construction company, or failing to put a stop sign at, if you've ever driven through construction on the highway, they have like temporary intersections. That's still under their control. And if they, don't have like a stop sign or something like that, I don't think there's a one size fit all though. Yeah, just like everything, it depends.
Yeah, because that hearing you say that is interesting because people hear about the stories about similar, not exactly, but similar to like the dirt pile blocking people's views, but more specifically the temporary intersections, the temporary stop signs, and things of that nature. For me, I didn't really know that can fall under more or less a construction company or the private company that's doing the construction. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And unless I think in most cases it would, because generally cities hire construction companies. They don't have their own city employees building major roadways. They just don't have the manpower.
And those people are the people with boots on the ground that are, there day to day, making sure things are going as it's supposed to. So they're the ones that would really know what's going on.
Okay. And I know we sort of like it's sort of been alluded to during the conversation, but so I want to ask you, who would ultimately be responsible for these collisions because of constructions? Like the city, the construction company, or is there even like someone else, like a third party not many people would know about in these instances?
So I'm going to say it again. You're going to hear it so many times today, but it depends.
Yeah.
It depends on really the facts and circumstances and what the issue is that caused the collision. Again, it could be a government vehicle. It could be the construction, like the general contractor that's out there and they don't, they decide to pile their amount of dirt blocking views. It could be the sign company that's hired to put signs out and they don't put it in the right spot. It could be the engineering firm who designed the actual roadway and don't design it properly. So like there's several layers of different people that potentially could have fault. And it really just depends on what happens and, what ultimately is causing the problems. So depends.
Okay. Yeah, and also because we feel like I mentioned like stuff like the temporary intersections and the road signage can lead to collisions and things of that nature. Phil, I wanted to go a little bit deeper in that area. Is that what are some other common signage mistakes that could lead to car collisions?
I think probably the most common that I can think of is that a sign is just gone because of a previous accident or incident. For example, a drunk driver goes up the road and hits a stop sign at a busy intersection. The city at that point under the TTCA has a duty to replace it within a reasonable time. So it's fact specific of what is a reasonable time, but that would be I think an example that happens a lot. Especially the more crowded the road is, the more likely stuff like that is going to happen.
Yeah, because that's interesting to me, how you had mentioned a reasonable time, because I feel like in some instances, I feel like it could, no matter the situation, it could always lean towards the city because they can be like, oh, well, something happened. So now, like at a later date, we finally had time to still fix it. But to us, it's still a reasonable amount of time. Like,
Exactly, yeah, and it's like we always say, it'll depend what's reasonable, I would think, on how heavy the traffic is in the area. When did the second accident happen? Like if it happened 10 minutes later, okay, like that, no one could get out there that fast, but if it happened a week, 2 weeks, certainly a month.
Well, and how many accidents have happened because of this sign? Or,
And that too, yeah.
if there's one accident, that's different than there's been 25 accidents and the city did nothing. It really depends on not just the time frame, but what happened since then.
Okay. And with those collisions, Julie, what's the process like when a collision does happen because of road signage? Is it still the same as construction collisions, or is it a bit different?
It's very similar to any other TTCA claim. Again, the key is gathering evidence quickly. So if we're talking about a sign that's not there that should be, getting photos of it being gone would be number one. You want, first thing, photos of how the condition is at or near the time that the collision occurs before any changes happen. You want to do open records requests to see just how many collisions have occurred at this intersection. Maybe search the internet to look for news reports or social media with people in the community complaining about issues. I mean, all of these things, it's really, for these types of cases, it's really fact intensive. And so you kind of have to investigate and dig into it to really be able to prove a case. So I'd say maybe a little bit more investigating than your normal car collision, maybe, not necessarily. But again, you have to send notice. You have to do all those things that the statute requires, because it still is a Texas Tort Claims Act case.
Also, the public records request is really important because about the intersection, because not all, a lot of who you can hold liable is who controls the intersection. Not all signs, like where they put them, are up to the city. In a pretty well-known, I was digging into this morning, part of the most recent Texas Supreme Court case in this issue was actually in the Houston area, where a private engineering firm was in charge of putting warning signs about going the wrong way in an intersection. And it wasn't the city, it was the engineering firm who, given the discretion of where to put them and whatnot, and they really didn't have any warnings wrong way. And a drunk driver went down the wrong way and really hurt a family. So you would think, without digging deeper, that, oh, that's definitely the city. We can't hold anyone liable, but the attorneys for this family dug deeper and found out, like, oh wait, actually it's this private company that was in charge of it.
Yeah,
what makes these cases really hard is, even if it's a private company, you have to have the documents and the plan documents in the hands of your own expert, because we have to hire experts in these cases to prove that an engineer didn't do the right thing. They didn't design it properly. They didn't put the sign where it should have been. So we have to go hire experts to prove that, hey, what they did wasn't the reasonable way to do it, or not the correct way to do it. And in order to do that, we have to have all the documents that say what it was that they did. And so that's why doing those open records requests are super important. And it's hard because as soon as they sniff out the fact that it's potentially going to go into litigation, there's ways they can stop you from getting your open records request. So they're they're tricky. And, there are statutes that even going after these private like architects and engineers, you have to file a certain type of document to sue them, or else you get torn out and you lose. So again, you have to have all of your ducks in a row. You have to have all of your experts lined up and basically prove your case even before you get into litigation on these types of cases.
And something that can be so frustrating is that we have no control when a client walks in our office. The accident could have happened a year and a half ago, and under Texas law, you have 2 years to sue it. And you're like, okay, so we have 6 months to get all the design plans. And if the city pushes back, you may not meet that deadline to get design plans to an expert engineer to review to see if the company did something wrong. So it's, yes, so fact specific and depends on the case. And that is one of the toughest things, having to do so much preliminary due diligence, which takes time.
Well, and there's notice provisions in the statute. So say that client walks in 6 months prior to the statute of limitations, you are required by the Texas Tort Claims Act to provide notice with very specific things at a certain time frame. And that changes whether it's the state or whether it's, you know, by city, because every city can delineate a specific time frame that they have to receive this notice by. And unless, you know, if you don't give actual notice, you have to fall back on constructive notice, which basically means they should have known, but, you know, that's not a good place to be ever. And so, you know, there's a lot of nuance. I think Phil said it right, nuance. These cases are so nuanced and so fact specific.
Yeah, that's interesting, because like hearing all of this, especially in situations where a client or someone might walk in when it's close to that statute of limitations. And the other thing I thought was interesting, how when you're trying to dig into those design documents, or when the companies are hearing that it might go to litigation, that they might try to give you some pushback in these situations. I wanted to ask like a follow-up question, like how long does it take for the, in your experience, how long does it take for the review process of the design documents, of the, let's say the signage and the intersections and stuff like that to occur? Phil?
I don't have like a exact time frame I can give you, but at least I would think a month, especially if the person you need to review it is pretty busy, which they probably are. It's extremely technical stuff. You probably need 3 cups of coffee to get through half of it.
Not espresso.
Yeah. Julie, how about you? In your experience, like any like a general time frame like that you have noticed?
The people, it takes for an expert to review the documents, or?
Yes, for the experts to review.
It really depends on how many it is, you know, how big of a project is it? How much, you know, how many plans? I mean, there can be thousands of pages of plans and they're all teeny tiny. You know, if you've ever seen engineering documents, they have tiny little prints. And so, and they are very technical. So it can take some time. I wouldn't say, you know, it really depends on the expert. It depends on how much experience they have, and if they know right where to go in those plans and they're not that busy, they might be able to knock it out quicker. But I mean, the key is getting those plans, having them, and finding the right expert to be able to review them. I mean, there's only certain people that are available that do that type of work. You know, there's not that many people. And so, yeah, Phil's probably right. They're very busy. So it depends on their schedule and how much they've got on their plate right now.
Okay. So overall, we covered poor weather conditions, poor road conditions, collisions due to road construction and road signage. I wanted to leave off, I wanted to ask both of y'all, do y'all have like any stories or comments, or even like bringing up cases that you might have worked on that's relevant to this topic? Julie?
So we can't go into details about specific cases, just because of confidentiality purposes, but I would say, you know, as far as road design, road construction cases and signage cases, I think it's really important that they're brought. You know, they are important because of community safety. And so the cases that I'm thinking of that I've handled that involve road construction, you know, they are usually at intersections where a lot of people travel. And at least in the cases I've been involved in, there have been a lot of accidents that occurred prior to the accident of my clients that came in and sought help. And so, you know, it really is a community safety thing. You know, if there's a systematic issue and it's coming to light because accidents keep happening, then, you know, that's where it can be really helpful to bring one of these types of cases. And, you know, the two cases off the top of my head that I'm thinking of both involved road construction and in general community safety. So
Yeah, to add to that, I think it's just, it impacts so many more people than a traditional like rear end car collision, where in those cases, it's of course really important to the community for everyone to drive safely, but it's less direct, like the impact. An unsafe road, especially on a major like intersection or highway, impacts, you know, thousands of people. So
Yeah.
you could, and the issue is, you know, you could have someone two people drive super carefully, neither did anything wrong, and there still could be an accident, which is a scary thought.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like with these road construction signage, it's all about safety, because people, like you had mentioned, drivers can drive safely, but something is wrong with signage, or on the construction side something is happening, then it can mess up that safety and the safety of the roads. So yeah, so that's it for this episode of The Verdict. Be sure to check out our other episodes in this series about personal injury with car collisions and the topics surrounding them. And if you're listening to this on any podcast platform, be sure to rate us 5 stars, the maximum amount of stars that you can. And if you're watching this on YouTube, the video version, be sure to subscribe to the Carlson Law Firm, like this video. And also, if you want to go into more detail about the relevant topics presented in today's episode, be sure to check out the video description. We'll have blogs that with these topics that are relevant. And then also, we're on social media. Check us out: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, the Carlson Law Firm. And also, we have a page dedicated in Spanish. We have a bilingual legal team. Carlson Abogados is the Spanish Facebook page. And lastly, if you're looking for an attorney, we offer free consultations. You can reach us at 800-359-5690. We take calls 24/7. So until next time, thank you, Julie. Thank you, Phil, for joining me on this episode.